Welcome to the first ever Psychedelic Times podcast. My name is Joe Mattia, and I'm the founder at psychedelictimes.com. We just launched our site a few months ago, and I'm very excited to extend our reach with this broadcast. I'm so honored and really grateful for the opportunity to chat with our first guest. He's the founder of MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. It's a really important nonprofit organization in the psychedelic therapy and research community. Rick Doblin, he's a true pioneer and leader in this movement, and he actually unknowingly influenced me with the inspiration and confidence to start psychedelictimes.com. Currently, MAPS is doing a revolutionary study with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. It's for war veterans who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Did you know that 22 vets commit suicide every day? It's heartbreaking, and this research is showing promising results. A few months ago, I met Rick at Burning Man. Lana, my wife, and we were volunteering at the Zendo camp. It's a harm reduction project sponsored by MAPS. Basically, Zendo provides a safe space for people at festivals having challenging psychedelic experiences. Instead of taking them to the medical tent or to the police, people can regroup at the Zendo camp. We bumped into Rick at the volunteer training for the Zendo. There are actually a few articles on the site about our experience at the Zendo, if you want to check those out. We told him about Psychedelic Times, and he actually got pretty excited. He asked how he can help, and that's how this podcast came to be. In this podcast, we cover several intriguing subjects I think you guys are really going to like. But one that particularly inspires me is MAP's new corporate structure. They formed a Public Benefit Corporation that's owned by the nonprofit. This, ladies and gentlemen, is history. If it goes as planned, it will be the first pharmaceutical company owned by a nonprofit. That is a psychedelic pharmaceutical company. And it'll handle all the creation and distribution for MDMA to therapists. The profits earned will be funneled back to the nonprofit for more research. So not only is this revolutionary for the psychedelic community, but it's revolutionary for other innovative projects that are looking for creative ways to find means to plug into the system and benefit the public at large. So without further ado, I bring you Rick Doblin. Hey, Rick, are you with us?
Yes, Joseph, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Yeah, thanks so much for taking time out. And I know it's a busy day for you. You got a lot going on, so thank you so much.
Yeah, well, even though I do have a lot going on, I think the public education that you're trying to do through the Psychedelic Times is really important because, you know, as we all know, there was just, you know, the massive backlash against the psychedelic 60s. And now we're in the midst of this incredible renaissance in psychedelic research. But what's really different between the backlash and now is public opinion, which is now a lot more sympathetic to this kind of exploration. And so that's where I just very much appreciate the opportunity to work with you on more public education.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I mean, I have to give you credit. I mean, here I am. I think MAPS is coming up on 30 years, right? And so I'm standing on the shoulders of giant, you know? I mean, really. So thank you.
You're standing on the shoulders of somebody who's very persistent. It's true. This is our 29th year, and our 30th anniversary is in April of 2016. And on the one hand, you know, that's pretty exciting. On the other hand, it could be pretty demoralizing because when you think about it, MDMA was criminalized in 1985. You know, I actually decided personally to become a psychedelic therapist and focus on trying to bring back psychedelics back in 1972. So when I was 18 years old. So I've been at this for a long time. And on the other hand, you know, empires have risen and fallen in this period of time. You know, I mean, look at Google and Facebook and all sorts of things are just enormous. And yet here we are, you know, still struggling to get legal access to psychedelics by prescription, let alone, you know, for personal growth but the whole things are, you know, moving in the right direction. There's a general sense that the war on drugs was counterproductive, and there's a growing appreciation for the therapeutic, creative, spiritual potential of non-ordinary states of consciousness. So I think while there's enormous cultural turmoil and struggles, at the same time, I just keep ending up being a lot more optimistic and hopeful than pessimistic. And so,
Well, yeah, you give hope to the community. Speaking from someone who's recently entering this as a professional, this world and this idea of psychedelic therapy and making it available in a legal way. And you are that hope in and MAPS and what you guys are doing and the people that I meet at these events with you speaking, and this creates hope. So you're 30, and now that you've done the math, what is it, 40 some years?
yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, we can definitely all thank you for that very diligent work and not giving up, because it looks like there's some light coming through here at the end of the tunnel. And maybe we could talk a little bit about kind of where, well, let's do the history. I mean, you mentioned a little bit about, 1986, MAPS started, MDMA criminalized in 85. Let's catch some people up who may not know exactly where things are and how we got here.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess, well, to be very fast about some of the history, for the West, in a way, we could say that things started late in the 1890s with the interest by William James in the nitrous oxide and also in peyote, although he got nauseous from peyote, and William James being the sort of founder of American psychology, and the psychology building at Harvard is the William James building, and he wrote the Varieties of Religious Experience. And then also we had Hefter, a German scientist, synthesized mescaline out of the peyote cactus in the late 1890s. So from that point on, there was a bunch of research with mescaline in the 20s and 30s. And then in 38, Albert Hofmann invents LSD, but gave it to animals and didn't see anything interesting with it, and then accidentally dosed himself when he was resynthesizing it in 1943, which led to an incredible flourishing of psychedelic research in a non-controversial way throughout starting in the late 40s to the 50s and 60s, when the dark side of it was the army, the military, mind control research, and actually it was through some of the CIA experiments that Ken Kesey was exposed to LSD, and it was actually some people connected to doing work with the CIA. Frank Barron was personality testing for CIA, and he ended up telling Timothy Leary about mushrooms. So out of sort of this cultural ferment of the 60s and the psychedelics being associated with counterculture, then comes this massive backlash. And that was when over 40, incredible number of research studies had been done with psychedelics, and mostly LSD and psilocybin. And these were studies that were the most exciting things happening in psychiatry. A lot of people don't realize that even the whole discussion about neurotransmitters and serotonin was facilitated by LSD. People were starting to think, how could something so powerful as LSD have such a profound effect? And maybe there were other chemicals like that, neurotransmitters in the brain. And that led to the discovery of the serotonin system and then other neurotransmitters. And so then, because of political factors, massive crackdown happens in the starting in the late 60s, the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, and then President Nixon talking about Timothy Leary being the most dangerous man in America. And not only were all these drugs criminalized, but the overreaction took them out of scientific laboratories as well for multiple decades. And then a lot of the people that were involved with psychedelics went trying to explore non-drug alternatives to changing consciousness.
Right.
And there was just a really profound interest in meditation and all sorts of hyperventilation, fasting, techniques that have been around for thousands of years. People have been exploring different ways to alter consciousness, and a lot of the community of Zen meditators were really people that had originally been inspired by psychedelics and then went to look for things that could help them integrate those experiences on a more permanent level. And at that point in 1971 is when I first did LSD. And when I woke up to the potential of it, it was just as things were being shut down. And I actually wrote a letter to Stan Groff, who was the world's leading LSD researcher at the time at Johns Hopkins. He was a Czech psychiatrist that came to the U.S. after the Russians invaded the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia. And he was just at Johns Hopkins. I wrote him a letter, and he even replied to me, which was just astonishing.
That's amazing.
And I still have that. I took a workshop with Stan, actually, in the summer of 1972. And then realized that I had been trying to sort of accelerate my development through repeated use of LSD and other psychedelics, but in a way where I couldn't really integrate it. And I wasn't prepared emotionally to handle what was happening. And I kind of reluctantly acknowledged that you can't do all the work in the inner world. I mean, you have to work out in the outer world and integrate it and put it into practice. And so for me, I ended up dropping out of college and spending 10 years trying to, little by little, go back and take smaller amounts of LSD. And I got involved in construction in the physical world as a way to get grounded. And I thought that basically the whole movement had been wiped out, and that all that was going on was some people writing books about stuff that had happened before, and people doing non-drug alternatives. And then finally, I felt ready, mature enough to try to go back to college and study psychedelics. And I felt like I finally had learned how to do what I wanted to do in an institutional setting. And so I went back to college in 82 and spent the first month. I went to New College of Florida in Sarasota, Florida. It's now the Honors College of the state of Florida, and it permits off-campus study. And so I did the first month at Esalen in Big Sur, California, in a workshop with Stan and Christina Groff in September of 1982. And then I learned, to my utter surprise, that there was this new drug called MDMA. And not only was there this new drug, but that the psychedelic community that I thought had been wiped out had just really gone underground, and that there was a whole community of hundreds of therapists and psychiatrists and others helping people work through challenging experiences and grow through the use of MDMA and other psychedelics, that there was this sort of psychedelic psychotherapy underground.
Right.
And that it was focused in large part on MDMA, which was legal. And so I thought, wow, I'm learning about MDMA now when it's still legal before the crackdown. And when I learned about it, it was already being sold in a public setting as ecstasy. So it was inevitable that there was going to be a crackdown. And then I started working with others involved in this community to try to protect MDMA. And we introduced it to various people all over the place who would then be helpful once the inevitable crackdown happened. And that started in 84 with the DEA trying to criminalize MDMA. And then I started a nonprofit before MAPS to organize our efforts. And we sued DEA for in an administrative law judge context about trying to say that MDMA should stay in Schedule 3, meaning it would be available as a therapeutic tool. And the DEA administrative law judge agreed with us. And then the head of the DEA rejected that recommendation, and we sued in the appeals courts a couple times and won, but they kept rejecting it. And eventually the DEA figured out how to satisfy the appeals courts. And so then I realized in 1986 that the only way to really bring MDMA back and bring psychedelics back, as far as I could tell, was going to be through science, through medicine, through healing, and working with people who are suffering, for whom psychiatric medicines weren't working. And so then MAPS began as a nonprofit psychedelic and medical marijuana pharmaceutical company in 1986. And so then we've got...
I had read, or maybe it was on one of the other podcasts with you that I've heard, a little bit about the roots of Esalen and MAPS starting. Was it literally at Esalen where it had originally, the idea had come?
Yeah. I mean, it was at Esalen where Dick Price and Michael Murphy were the two people that started Esalen.
Right.
And they had a little bit of different visions for it. They were great partners, but Michael Murphy was more spiritual in a sense, and he saw Esalen more as like an ashram. It's sort of the foundation place for the human potential movement. And Dick Price saw Esalen more as an asylum for people that needed space to reconstitute themselves. And so Dick was the one that lived at Esalen, practiced Gestalt therapy, and was very involved with psychedelics. And so there was a series of meetings at Esalen that were designed to try to figure out how to protect MDMA and support the psychedelic community. And it was at one of those meetings in early '84 that Terence McKenna and others were there. I was there, and Terence was, he's kind of well known for his view that plant medicines are, to be preferred, both
superior, yeah,
ayahuasca and psilocybin mushrooms, as compared to synthetics like LSD or MDMA. And so I thought that's a ridiculous position, but he was going on and on about how, really MDMA was just a synthetic and forget about it. And I was like, well, we should do a study. And I said, all right, I'll put up $1,000. Let's do a study. And then Dick Price said, all right, I'll put up $1,000. And so that began the first research with MDMA. Other people donated as well. And that also is where we got the idea to start a nonprofit to protect MDMA. And so really Esalen was where this idea of using the system. I mean, and this I think is really for me the key point, is that when you self-identify as the counterculture, first off, you build an oppositional situation, and since the culture is usually bigger than the counterculture, you're probably going to get crushed. Right. But then you don't avail yourselves of some of the ways in which our system is wonderfully designed to promote change. And so, using the IRS code and using nonprofits, our country is really more advanced with nonprofits than most other countries of the world. And so just this idea that then there's certain properties built into our constitutional framework that channel dissent and even give dissenters certain powers that in other countries you just be squashed. So, it was really at Esalen that this idea of both trying to coordinate to protect MDMA and then also to use the nonprofit system to raise resources to do research that the for-profit pharmaceutical companies and the governments and major foundations, we're not actually supporting.
Right.
So, yeah, Esalen was just the cradle for a lot of things in this area. And Stan Groff at the time was a scholar in residence at Esalen, and that's where he really helped develop the holotropic breath work, which is a non-drug technique to impact consciousness through hyperventilation. And I think that the key point of that is to recognize that what we're really talking about is states of mind that can be accessed in multiple different ways, and that the psychedelics are not unique in that, although for many people they're the most effective, the most direct, but that they're not unique, that people have been able to access these states of mind through multiple different ways, through thousands of years, through yoga, through meditation, through fasting, through, we even talk about Jesus' 40 days in the desert, the people have gone out to these isolated areas. And so I think that helps us to understand that we don't have psychedelic experiences, we have human experiences mediated by psychedelics. And based on that, we have tremendous inner resources that we can call on in different ways that we don't need to be scared of because they're part of ourselves.
Beautiful. Yeah. I'm right there with you, and I think that I thank you for the history on the Esalen and their connection to MAPS. I find it really fascinating. It's somewhere I've been able to spend quite a bit of time since moving to California, and it's nice to know that its history is so deeply rooted in this, and that you have this diplomatic approach to using and working with the system to make change, and through the use of nonprofits and these various methods for not going against, which I think is a great mindset in psychology that you have that doesn't always come up for people in psychedelic experiences. And I think you said this is the paradigm, that you change that thought that I'm the outcast, or that I have to go against this system, or and that you're working with it. And how did that happen? Where did that come from? Was it something that you were raised with your parents, or was that out of a psychedelic experience, or where did that come from that you decided to go, okay, I'm gonna choose this route, I'm not gonna go this.
Well, part of it was that I grew up in the 60s and I saw the backlash against the counterculture, but before that I was a mainstream kind of person. I mean, my parents are I would say left-wing liberals, and they were very supportive of my, political engagement. I grew up in Chicago, outside of Chicago. I was actually, in 1968, I was almost 14 years old, almost 15, and I was a small precinct captain for Eugene McCarthy. And he didn't actually win any votes in our area, or hardly any. And so I wanted to get involved with the politics of the day. And so I actually volunteered for Mayor Daley of Chicago and worked as a runner for the delegates in the Chicago Convention of 1968, which people may remember or have heard about. It was where the police riots, and it was just a horrific thing. And so I was inside the convention watching on the TV monitors all the riots that were taking place outside, which radicalized me and of course many others, but not to the point where I wanted to reject everything, but because I grew up in a again in this sense of being supported by the system. I mean, I'm Jewish, and I was just aware of how distant relatives were killed by Hitler, of how precious the freedoms were that we had in America. And so I appreciated that, and I felt protected by America, and I never really wanted to, tear it all down. Right. I just wanted it to be more open. And so I just had this sense, I think, that, even right now is a good example. So I've got a station wagon, I've got the classic, house with a picket fence and a wife and kids, and a suburban existence, and I just want to have that kind of calm suburban life that happens to involve psychedelics and marijuana, and that should be legal. So that, I think, is a lot of what drives me. Is I was, as a child, just super integrated into the system, and it was only my interest in psychedelics that created me in this sense of opposition to the drug war and the powers that be in some ways. And so I really just want to go back to being just a normal patriotic American who happens to find inspiration and healing and spirituality involving psychedelics and marijuana.
Right.
So, and I think the backlash is what really showed me too, that kind of oppositional countercultural thinking isn't likely to work. And in fact, there's a terrific book by Aldous Huxley called Island. And it's the last book that he wrote in his life. And it's about an idyllic society on this island where they have integrated the use of psychedelics in the training of young people. And I really recommend it. I mean, most people know about Aldous Huxley for even, The Doors of Perception, from which the band The Doors got their title, or for, just his kind of dystopian novels. And I think he wrote about an island that he described this, idyllic society. But while he was writing it, he changed his mind, and the novel ends. I guess you'd call this a spoiler alert. The novel ends with the larger culture outside the island coming in search of oil and destroying their culture, and that really taught me that and also the whole nuclear weapons and the idea of nuclear winter and what happens if there's an exchange of nuclear weapons between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Just that there's no escape. There's no safe place, and I think we see that now more and more, where people are talking about global warming. That we've had the pictures of Earth from space. All of these things are lessons in a way that we can't go off to some little isolated spot and build our little paradise, that we have to go to the heart of the system,
right,
and reform it from the inside out.
Yes.
And that's the core vision. And so that's where Dr. Michael Midhofer, who's now our lead psychiatrist working on the MDMA PTSD studies, in a conference in 2000 that Ralph Metzner, who was with Richard Alpert, Ram Dass, and Timothy Leary at Harvard. Ralph had a conference on ayahuasca, and Michael was a member of MAPS. He'd also been trained by Stan Groff in the holotropic breathwork, but I didn't know him and hadn't met him. And he came to me at this conference, and he said, I wanted to get involved in working with you on trying to set up some offshore clinic somewhere where we could do psychedelic psychotherapy. And actually he had been involved one of his patients had done Ibogaine in St. Kitts with Deborah Mash. And in order for him to learn about Ibogaine, he went there to St. Kitts to watch the treatment and thought it was fascinating. So then he approached me and said, let's do this project on some island somewhere, find some island and set up a psychedelic clinic for more than just Ibogaine. And my first reaction was, no, I don't want to do that at all. I think the political dynamics are changing, and let's try to do work inside the U.S. and let's work with the FDA. And he agreed to do that. And that was that key turning point from, trying to find some safe place on the periphery to trying to create safety from the inside out. And, that's why it's taken a lot longer. But at the same time, I think the potential benefits are much greater. And there's just another point I want to make about this, which is that we tend to really... I have, for sure, sort of tended to think about the police as the agents of the drug war, and has built up a fear of the police.
Sure.
And I think you mentioned earlier about, I don't know if
that's fine. Absolutely.
Okay. You mentioned that you had some problems with the police when you were 15.
Yeah, sure.
With marijuana. And so the police have tended to be the enemy in a lot of different ways. And I think that's been a terrible situation, because most of what the police do, we're really in favor of, but they have been, agents of this racist, punitive, horrible policy. And so when we start thinking about MDMA for PTSD, the current study that we're just finishing now was mostly going to be for veterans. And I thought, okay, just to sort of send a political message, for political symbolism, we would say that the study was for veterans, but also first responders, police officers, and firefighters. And I'd never really thought that we'd get any police officers or firefighters into the study. I knew that we would get a bunch of veterans, because there's just so many veterans with PTSD who are not sufficiently treated by the currently available medications or psychotherapies, which do work for some people, but not for everybody. So it was really just political symbolism. But as it's turned out, we've enrolled 26 people in the study. 22 are veterans, 3 are firefighters, including one who was at the World Trade Center in New York City on 9/11.
Wow.
And we actually have a police officer. So I think it's that sense that what we're offering in terms of healing trauma, that the police have one of, if not the most, likely job to expose people to traumatic situations.
Right.
Both the stress of what they're doing and then also the whole constant, dark side of humanity that they have to see.
Right.
And so to say that, yeah, let's build an alliance with the police. If we can show that MDMA can be helpful for the police to improve their functioning, their quality of life, to deal with their depression, to deal with all the things that they suffer from as part of their work, that's the sort of ultimate for me expression of trying to go to the mainstream and saying, yeah, we're going to help the police too.
Sure. And I think that's the genius element to MAPS and the PTSD work you're doing, is that, we're helping the people, almost the forgotten people in our society right now, and the ones that it's easier to turn a nose to and say, oh, it's the police. But, healing these people and helping them and giving them loving compassion is exactly the answer. And it takes a good effort and a clean effort on your part to know that where you're coming from is from the heart. And I know that because I've personally met you, and I can feel that through, just researching all the work you're doing. It's kind of obvious, but then once you get to know Rick Doblin, then you can see, oh, we know where the intent is. So how is that going right now with that study? Can you talk a little bit about the results, or just some of, can you share a story about it?
Yeah. So that study is currently underway. We have just a couple weeks ago had the last experimental session. And so now there's some non-drug integrative sessions and some follow-up work still to do. But we have the data from the primary outcome measure. And the primary outcome measure is called the CAPS, the Clinician Administered PTSD Scale. And it's the measure that's used all over the world, developed by the VA. It was used by the FDA to approve the two medications, two SSRIs, Zoloft and Paxil, that are approved for the treatment of PTSD. And it's the key measure. And so if you can show clinically and statistically significant declines on the CAPS compared to placebo for whatever it is that you're trying to do, then you can get FDA approval for your medicine, assuming there's a balance of safety and efficacy. And so we have just done a preliminary analysis of the results. And I'll take a few more minutes maybe just to explain about the protocol, which is that one of the things that's challenging about trying to do psychedelic research is, how do you do a double-blind study? If you've got inactive pill versus, full dose LSD, psilocybin, or MDMA,
people are going to know.
People are going to know.
Yeah.
So a lot of my dissertation, which I did at, so I got my master's and PhD from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and I looked at the regulation of the medical use of Schedule I drugs. And a big part of my dissertation was on methodology for trying to address this double blind. And what I thought would work would be what's called dose response, where you can tell it apart from nothing, from an inactive placebo, and you can also tell it apart from other drugs. If you just give somebody stimulants and you give somebody else MDMA, trained therapists can tell the difference. And most people will be able to tell the difference as well. So active placebo didn't seem to be a good option. Plus the stimulants, when you look at people who self-medicate for PTSD, they self-medicate with alcohol, with marijuana, with things that aren't activating the same way as methamphetamine would be, or cocaine. You don't find many people with PTSD using stimulants because they want to move away from their experiences rather than heighten them.
Sure.
In those ways. So it seemed like dose response is the way to go, meaning that everybody gets MDMA, but they don't know what dose they're getting. And then you could show that if you could do this, then you show that the people that got the high dose did better than the people that get the middle dose, and they did better than the people that got the low dose. And people would be then successfully blinded to which dose they got, and that would be the way to do the double blind. So the current study is designed with 3 different groups. One group gets 30 milligrams of MDMA, and the way we do this, it's 8-hour sessions with a male-female co-therapist team. And after between 1.5 and 2.5 hours into it, we offer the opportunity, and it's a discussion between the therapist and patients about taking half the initial dose. And that extends the plateau. So that makes it a longer experience. So one group gets 30 milligrams, and then they have the option for 15 milligrams. The second group was going to get 75 milligrams with the option of 37.5. And then the full dose group was going to get 125 milligrams with 62.5 as the optional supplemental dose.
I just have a question about the option.
Sure.
So is that
Sure.
that's something that the therapists say would keep time on and say, okay, how are you now? Is it a decision based on both, or who makes that decision? Does the therapist and the person receiving the medicine, or both?
Both.
Okay.
Both. So it's definitely a shared decision. And just to give you a little bit of another sense, is that we would never give somebody the drug. So even in a little way, we want people to make their own decisions. So just to illustrate that, the therapist never hands the pill, or it's actually a capsule. The therapist never hands the capsule to the person and says, okay, here's your dose, let's start it. They put it down in a cup or a bowl, and the patient actually has to reach for it to take it. And that's part of empowering people to recognize that they're healing themselves and they're choosing themselves to do this work.
Right.
So, and there may be a situation where a subject in the study says, I want to do the supplemental dose, but the therapist might say, well, it doesn't seem to us like you need it, or you're doing really well without it, or, so there would be a discussion. So the final decision has to be on the part of the therapist. If they don't feel it's appropriate, they won't agree.
Right.
But they'll never give it to the patient without the patient wanting to do it.
I see.
So that's how it's done. And so what we discovered is that the theory, which I spent quite a lot of time developing, we discovered the beauty of clinical research, and the beauty of research, which is that sometimes your theories, however well they sound on paper, don't actually work in practice. And so we've got some surprising results from this study. So the first one is that the 30 milligram dose, and in other studies we've used 25 milligrams or 40 milligrams, and we have this international series of phase 2 pilot studies in Switzerland and Israel and Canada, and 3 studies in the U.S., that the lower dose actually seems to have an anti-therapeutic effect.
Wow.
And what I mean by that is that the MDMA reduces activity in the amygdala, in the fear processing portions of the brain, and increases activity in the frontal cortex, where you put things in association. And people who have had PTSD, and we work only with people that have chronic PTSD and who are treatment resistant, who have failed on other medications, that the problem is for them that it comes to that their trauma comes to them in nightmares, comes to them all the time during the day. There's all these triggers that they hear a sound, or they see something that somebody abused them and they were wearing a certain kind of colored clothes, and they see those colored clothes, or so these are people that have tried to protect themselves. They can't work through these feelings, but they can't get away from them. And so in our therapeutic setting, where they're supposed to be trying to work on it, the low dose is a little bit activating, but it doesn't do enough of the reduction of fear. So people actually find it much more uncomfortable than not.
Right.
And in fact, more uncomfortable than the inactive placebo. So,
so this is an instance where maybe microdosing is it's the opposite in this case. With MDMA, you're not getting the...
Yeah, I wouldn't call it microdosing though, because when we talk about microdosing, we're usually talking about, LSD or psilocybin, where you have enough that you don't really, not really tripping. It's maybe 5 or 10 micrograms, a milligram or so of psilocybin, things like that. That there's, and so this is maybe sometimes microdosing. It's not even noticeable that you've taken it.
Okay.
So we're not that far away from microdosing, but yeah, in this case, for people that are dealing with trauma, and again, that would be different from somebody that was normally happy but wanted to explore microdosing. So that's a distinction. But what we find is that the therapy alone, and what our approach is, we call it MDMA assisted psychotherapy. Our main intervention is psychotherapy. It's not just MDMA. And so the psychotherapy alone with placebo MDMA does better than the psychotherapy with 25, 30, or 40 milligrams of MDMA. And in fact, we find that several people have said that it was so uncomfortable that they dropped out of the study.
Wow.
Okay, then the bigger surprise for us was that the 75 milligram group did fantastic. And not only did they do fantastic, but actually they did better than the full dose group in terms of reducing PTSD symptoms. Now, it's not statistically different, the difference between the 75 milligrams and 125 milligrams. So what that means is that maybe it was a chance finding, but if we had larger numbers of subjects, and if these findings were consistent, then it would be statistically significant. But
right.
but clearly, what we've found is that at least in this particular group, and again, it's not statistically significant difference, but the 75 milligram group is doing phenomenal, way better than we thought. We didn't think it would even do that well. And personally, when I think of taking MDMA, I think, God, I don't really want to do 75 milligrams. It's kind of an awkward place. And for me, it's like the turbulence when you take off of an airplane. The first, few minutes, as you get to cruising altitude, there's a lot more shaking, and then you're kind of smoothly cruising. And so I think that's the case for a lot of people who take MDMA in non-medical settings, that they want more than 75 milligrams. But in a context where we're trying to help people overcome their PTSD, the 75 milligram group worked really, really well. And that's led us to, now the 125 group worked great also. Well, more than enough to, get it approved as a medicine, and for some of the people in that group to feel like they no longer had PTSD afterwards. But what it's led us to try to understand is this whole concept of memory and memory reconsolidation. And so there's now, because of our results, other people have been funding mechanism of action studies. And we worked closely with Dr. Richard Rockefeller for years. And he was just a tremendous, tremendous man. And he had been chairman of the board of advisors of Doctors Without Borders, and became aware of whole populations that are traumatized and wanted to help us with MDMA. And the main work that he did was trying to help us with the military, with the Veterans Administration and Department of Defense, to reach out to them. And that work was successful. And then he tragically, about a year and 4 months ago, died in a plane crash. And to honor him, his family has sponsored research at Rockefeller University into the mechanisms of action of MDMA and in terms of memory reconsolidation. Okay, so what that means is that when we have a memory, it used to be thought that you have a memory, it's like pulling a book off a shelf. And you look at the book, you recall the memory, and then you stick the book back on the shelf. But it's not quite like that. And it's like you take this book off the shelf, but in order to put it back on the shelf, you actually have to reprint the book. You reconsolidate the memory. And therein lies why people's memories change over time, but also offers the therapeutic potential. So that if you have a traumatic memory that was filled with fear when something was happening, when you recall it, it's recalled with that emotional fear connected to the memory. But if you could recall it while you're feeling safe, then when you reconsolidate the memory, you can remember the incident, but it's not necessarily tagged with the same fear emotions.
It doesn't have that charge because you've kind of created a new association.
Yes. Yeah. So that's, I think, where we're starting to try to understand is that MDMA reduces the fear response to emotional threats from the reducing activity in the amygdala. And then we find that people's memory for the trauma is actually enhanced, that people have blocked out a lot of the traumatic situations. They remember generally what happened, but there's a lot of stuff that they have forgotten. And under MDMA, those forgotten memories that were so painful and so fearful come back to them, but they're feeling safe. And so that's also part of the healing process, is that there's not these unconscious memories that are, beyond our awareness, that are sort of coloring our sense that the world is a dangerous place and I can't trust anybody and it's just really fearful and I have to constantly protect myself. So that the more the memories can come to the surface while people are feeling safe, then the more they reconsolidate in a way where they can learn from the memories, they can store them away, but they're past and not constantly seeming like they're still happening. And so it may be that at the 125 milligrams, there's a lot more going on than just thinking about your biographical traumatic memories. That people do tend to have more spiritual experiences at the higher doses. And here I just wanted to make another finding that's for those people who have been watching what's going on with the psilocybin research. Sorry, and there's incredible work with psilocybin with people with cancer who are anxious about dying, alcoholics, nicotine addicts, incredible work with psilocybin, and the early work in the 60s with LSD, with cancer patients and heroin addicts and alcoholics. What that showed is that there was a direct link between the depth of the mystical experience and the degree of therapeutic benefit. And in fact, when we see currently now the research that's being done with psilocybin and the prior research with LSD, the approach that was taken in the US was more about larger doses, trying to help people have this mystical experience.
It's one time.
Yeah, that just one time. And that sense of connection that you get, the mystical experience of unity and connection, that experience is linked to, not being so scared of dying or being able to get over the sense of isolation that a lot of people who are addicts have. And the thing that we've discovered in our MDMA research is that that's not the case, that we don't see a correlation between the mystical experience, and there are a fair number of people that have mystical experiences with MDMA, but we don't see a correlation between the mystical experience and therapeutic outcome when it comes to reducing PTSD. So it could be then that these lower doses or medium doses, let's say with MDMA, where people are more focused on their biography and their history, that may be very much more conducive to this process of memory reconsolidation. So now what we're thinking about for phase 3, our model, as I said, it's really about the psychotherapy, and the psychotherapy is just enhanced, assisted by MDMA. And it's a 3.5-month process, more or less. So there's about 3 weekly non-drug psychotherapy sessions, 90 minutes each usually, to prepare people for their first MDMA experience. And then their MDMA experience takes place in an inpatient setting. It's in 8 hours. It starts usually 10 in the morning, goes till 6 at night. people spend the night in the treatment center. We want them to rest and reflect. And then the next day, there's multiple hours of reviewing what happened and going over and helping them integrate it. And then they go home, and we call them every day on the phone for a week.
For a whole week?
5 minutes, 15 minutes, every day, just to check in.
That's great.
To make sure that they're integrating it smoothly. And then they get weekly non-drug psychotherapy sessions for 3 to 5 more weeks. That's to help them integrate what happened and to prepare them for the next session. And then the next session is 3 to 5 weeks apart. And then we repeat that 3 times. So it looks like our treatment program, and then we have 3 sessions after the last MDMA session, and then we have a 2-month and 1-year follow-up. So what we're saying is that there's this extended period. We believe that a lot of people some people will only need 1 session. We feel more people, could do fine with just 2 sessions, but even though it's going to cost us millions of dollars to add the 3rd session, what Michael Midhofer has said is that there's something about the 2nd session where people go the deepest. Okay. And the 1st session, they've built a relationship with the therapist. They understand what MDMA does. They understand that they can feel better by opening up rather than blocking these painful experiences. And the 2nd session, they often do really deeper work. But in part, it's because they know that there's going to be a 3rd session, meaning that you can get into stuff really deep, and you don't have to have the feeling, okay, I have to resolve it all in this 1 session because it's my last.
Right.
So having a session that's not the first and not the last helps the 2nd session go deeper.
That makes sense. That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, so what we're thinking of now for phase 3, we're considering that the 1st session would be the 75 milligram session. And then the 2nd session, there'll be a discussion between the subject or the patient and the therapist. Do they want to stay at that dose level or go up to the 125 milligrams? And then the 3rd session, there'll be a similar thing. Let's say they went up to the 125 milligrams in the 2nd session. Then the 3rd session is, do you want to stay there or do you want to go down to a lesser amount of MDMA? And so that's how we think we're going to design phase 3. We're not sure about that. We have another study in Boulder, which is 23 subjects for people with PTSD from any cause. That's not quite done yet. We still have some more therapeutic sessions going on in that. We'll have the final primary outcome data in December from that study. And we've treated the final person in our Canadian study. And in Israel, we've got another couple weeks to try to enroll 2 more people in that study, which will be 10 people. And then we're going to gather all the data. And we will have exposed well over 90 people to MDMA, 90 PTSD patients. And then we summarize all that data and submit it to the FDA and say, let's see about moving to phase 3. Now, also, we have studies that are MDMA for autistic adults with social anxiety, which is going great, down at Harbor UCLA with Dr. Charlie Grob. And we have also started a study with MDMA for people with a life-threatening illness that are anxious about dying up in San Anselmo with Dr. Phil Wolfson. And that's underway as well. So we're looking at other indications. And what's really exciting is that we are starting to develop 2 studies in association with researchers that have worked with the Veterans Administration. And when we started talking with the National Center for PTSD and started talking about blending MDMA with existing non-drug psychotherapies, the first one that they recommended to us was called cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. Conjoint meaning couples. So it's couples therapy, where one of the couple has PTSD, but it affects the relationship.
Sure.
So this is now an opportunity for us to work with couples. And we're going to be primarily looking at the person with PTSD, but we're also going to be looking at the strength of the relationship. And so, because we're talking about moving drugs through the FDA, it's only for treatment of clinical conditions. And we can never get MDMA approved by the FDA for couples therapy because difficult relationships not a disease. We can only treat diseases. But here's a chance for us to really start looking at couples therapy, which I think is one of the best uses of MDMA.
Sure.
And will be something that eventually I think MDMA will be used for, quite a bit. And so those are sort of what we're doing with MDMA. And we're also about to start a study with marijuana for PTSD. And this was for political reasons. I guess I should say I was more interested in it than otherwise, because marijuana for PTSD can help a lot of people. There's loads of people, veterans and others, using marijuana for PTSD. But it's something that reduces the symptoms, helps them to not have nightmares, helps them focus on the present. But it doesn't really cure it. It's just palliative, and it requires daily dosing. But there's been political obstacles in the United States blocking research with marijuana. And I was always nervous. It's the same way as scapegoating. If you've got one group that you're scapegoating, you could easily switch your target to another group too, because it's the process of blaming others for your problems. And so I felt like if there's political obstructions that block research with marijuana, that could boomerang back and block psychedelics. And if we could overcome the political resistance to research with marijuana, that would protect the research with psychedelics. And so we've worked since 1992 to try to do drug development research with marijuana, and have had multiple studies approved by the FDA, but then the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which has a monopoly on marijuana, wouldn't provide us the marijuana. So we finally overcome that. We have a $2.15 million grant from the state of Colorado to do this marijuana PTSD study, and it will be in 76 veterans, and it will be taking place both at Johns Hopkins University and then in an independent facility in Phoenix, Arizona. So it's our first government grant as well.
I'm curious a little bit about if you could quickly talk about the protocol with that, because I mean, I smoking marijuana is pretty straightforward, but when you're specifically going to target PTSD, and how does that look?
Okay, well, great question too. So the first point there is that what we're starting to understand more and more, that marijuana is every strain of marijuana is different, and there's lots and lots of different cannabinoids in the marijuana plant. Particularly the main ones that we're aware of are called THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, and CBD, cannabidiol. And CBD is the one that's been talked about as helping children with epilepsy. It's generally not psychoactive in the same way that marijuana with THC is. But it has a lot of anti-pain, anti-spasticity, anti-epilepsy properties. And so the design of our study is going to be trying to figure out what are the relative contributions to PTSD treatment from either THC or CBD or the combination. So we're talking about using 4 different groups. One group will receive placebo marijuana. It's marijuana washed in alcohol, and it's not psychoactive at all, and it doesn't have THC or CBD or other cannabinoids. Then one group is going to have roughly 12% THC and no CBD, or less than 1%, very, very minimal CBD. Another group is going to have 12% CBD and virtually no THC. And then another group is going to receive, we wanted it to receive the combination 12% THC, 12% CBD, but NIDA couldn't produce that for us.
Oh, man.
Yeah, and their highest dose, their highest potency is 12% THC. And if you go to most dispensaries,
yeah, I'm in California, so
sell you 12%.
Right.
Yeah, but that's what we get. And there's only one source. It's the government monopoly.
Okay.
So they can provide us with, I think it's 7.7% THC and 7.9% CBD. But that's our combination treatment.
Man, they need some help.
Well, we're going to be applying soon to overcome the NIDA monopoly. We've been working on that since 2001 with Professor Lyle Craker at UMass Amherst, and that's been another long saga and DEA lawsuit. But the basic idea here is that people will receive marijuana on a daily basis for 3 weeks, one of these 4 different kinds. Before that, and these are veterans, some of them will have done marijuana before, but some of them may have never tried it before. So we have 2 4-hour introductory sessions, and this is part of our safety because some people have said, and in fact, what was really funny was one of the board of directors meetings at MAPS. Several of the people were saying they weren't so sure about marijuana for PTSD because when they smoke marijuana, it makes them anxious rather than calmer. So how is it that you're going to give marijuana that makes people anxious to people that have an anxiety disorder?
Right.
So we have to have a very careful safety protocol because it's very much likely that some people will get activated in ways that they don't like, and marijuana is not going to be for everybody for PTSD. And so what we're doing is these 2 4-hour sessions, one day after each other, because a lot of times people have said that when the first time they've tried marijuana, they didn't get high, and then the second time they did. So that's why we have 2 4-hour sessions, one day after another. Then they get 3 weeks. Everybody's going to get 1.8 grams per day, which is not a whole lot, but
it's being vaporized.
No. We initially designed the study that half the people would vaporize and half would smoke. And then when we wanted to work with the people at Johns Hopkins, they were like, "Oh, you got so many variables. You should reduce the number of variables." And I didn't really agree with them, but in a spirit of compromise, I said, "All right, let's just skip the vaporizing group." And the other is that there's a marijuana company called Privateer, for-profit marijuana company that's venture capital. They've raised well over $100 million, and they own a company in Canada, a marijuana producing company called Tilray. And they produce marijuana for about 5,000 patients. And part of our work, and I guess I haven't said this enough, is that we're nonprofit drug development. So we're trying to help the whole field. So we post our protocols up on the web. Everything is, we don't have proprietary information. Our treatment manual for MDMA, people could see on the MAPS website, maps.org. And so Tilray people said, "Hey, we want to do research with marijuana. Could we use your protocol?" And we said, "Sure." And then the more we talked with them, it turned out that they said that they'd be more interested in using the vaporization. And so I said, "Okay, we'll just do smoking and they'll do the vaporizing. And they're going to use their own marijuana, which is more potent than what we're getting from NIDA." So we're just using smoking. And so then after 3 weeks, there's a 2-week period of cessation. And this is because the belief is, and this is what people who have PTSD who use marijuana report, is if they don't use marijuana, then their symptoms come back. And again, it's a palliative. It's not about the search for a cure or a durable remission, which is what we're trying to achieve with the MDMA. So there's a 2-week period of cessation, and then there's another 3-week period of dosing during which people are randomized to something different. So those people that got the high THC will get either the high CBD or the combination THC CBD. And in that second period, we're going to eliminate the placebo dose because really everybody will be able to tell anyway. And what we're really trying to do is get people's preferences.
Right.
And so what's a little bit not confusing, but it's not ideal, is that what we're learning is that a lot of the people that do use marijuana for PTSD use a different strain during the day than during the night. So, people will use stuff with more CBD, more sedating, more indicas at night to help them sleep. And during the day, they'll use more activating to get them through the day, to focus them on the present. And so
like a sativa.
Yeah, more sativa stuff. So, but we're in the sort of early, phase 2 pilot study stage. And so we don't know if we have to prove everything. So we don't know if people will prefer THC or CBD or the combination. So we're only giving people one strain. And so then there's that second 3-week period, then another 2-week period of cessation, then 2-month and 1-year follow-ups. So that's the basic idea. It's going to take about 3 years to do the study once we start it. It took us 6 years. We're waiting now to get the DEA permission, and that's really not because the DEA is giving us any problems. It's because we have to build out the facility in Arizona, and then the DEA will give approval once it's completely built out and the safe is in there and the refrigerator and the freezer, and we have to get explosion-proof refrigerators and freezers, to try to protect the length of time that somebody would take to get into this. Not that anybody's going to really want to steal this marijuana, but
oh gosh, that's kind of funny.
It's hilarious. It's
explosion
totally
proof. But this is, again, the diplomacy. And okay, well, this is what you guys want. We'll give you explosion proof refrigerators. Great.
Yeah. Well, we're lucky because the state of Colorado, I mean, for those people that have been paying attention, I think they're talking about $125 million or so this year in tax income.
I did read that.
Yeah. So they've decided to give away $8 million for medical marijuana research.
Beautiful.
And we got the largest grant, and they've awarded $8 million. And so we're working on, state of Colorado money, and it's we're
and that
very
was what
grateful.
That was $2 million, I think you said, right?
2.15, 2,150,000.
Wow.
Amazing.
Really great. Wow.
Yeah, and I think that one of the best parts here that I'm most proud of is that we've brought into the study the experts from the Veterans Administration on the use of marijuana by vets with PTSD, the expert from the National Institute on Drug Abuse on the use of marijuana by all sorts of people with PTSD, and also we brought in one of the main skeptics about the use of marijuana for anything, but also for PTSD, a woman in Colorado, Paula Riggs. And so, what I've recognized is that a lot of people come to me and they say, how can we believe anything that MAPS does? Because you've obviously believed that these drugs work, and so therefore you're biased. And my response to them has been that everybody has a bias. I'm telling you what my bias is, so you've got to step ahead on that. But the whole purpose of scientific methodology is precisely to help people get over their biases. So rather than criticize me for being biased, what you should do is look at the methodology, because we're really trying as best we can to design a study. The results are reliable. And so then I realized if that argument works for me, and I mean that I believe it's true, that the focus should be on the methodology, that we could afford to take in somebody who didn't really believe that marijuana was helpful for PTSD, and that we would give her the job of being our scientific integrity consultant. And her job is to look at everything that we do and just say, hey, this procedure seems biased, or change this, or change that, or this sounds good.
Right.
So we've brought in the skeptic inside the tent.
I love that.
Yeah. And the good part of it is I was realizing that
what's going to happen is she's going to get turned over, and then she's not going to be a skeptic anymore.
Well, I don't know about that, but I do believe that whatever happens, people will believe our results, because it's going to be very hard to criticize us on methodological grounds.
Right. You're covering the basis, from all angles. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and then the other part I realized is that from the point of view of the state of Colorado, that they would be more likely to give us the grant, even though it was more expensive to bring in the skeptic to do this, that by doing so, even though it cost more money, we'd more likely get the grant. So it was the first study ever where I really was more relaxed about the cost of it and felt, okay, the more consultants we bring in, the more likely we are to get the grant.
Beautiful. I want to come back. Rick, do you have a little more time? Are we good?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So I want to come back on to the subject of the MDMA and where you are with all that, and this third round that's going to come up, and what the timing of that is, And then I'd like you to talk a little bit about the business structure of MAPS and this pharmaceutical company that's going to be owned by MAPS. And you spoke a little bit about it at the book release for Stan Groff in San Francisco. And I actually heard you speak a little bit about it at your talk at the Dr. Bronner's camp at Burning Man. But so I got a little bit about it, but I don't think there's a lot out there on the internet right now kind of where you're explaining this business structure and how it's going to work. And I find it really fascinating because from what I understand, this is the first time there will be a nonprofit owning a wholly owned pharmaceutical company.
Well, it's not quite the first. I mean, when I started MAPS in 1986, no drug had ever been approved by the FDA from a nonprofit organization. And it was 1999 that it happened. And it was actually a nonprofit group called the Population Council, which had been started by John D. Rockefeller III and had been funded in large part by Warren Buffett and some of the Pritzker family and others. They made, so it was a controversial drug, the abortion pill RU46, that no pharmaceutical company wanted to take on because their other products would be boycotted. And that was a nonprofit drug development. But the point there is that nonprofits can develop drugs. But then when it comes to marketing them, there's two choices. That if you want to market a drug at the exact same price that it costs you, that can stay inside the nonprofit because there is no profit.
I see.
However, if you want to sell the drug for a little bit more or not exorbitantly more, but if you want to sell it for a little bit more than what it costs you to raise money for more research, that is something that you should be paying taxes on. And so to the extent that becomes popular, to the extent that you have lots of sales for that, and I think MDMA for PTSD, there's millions and millions of people with PTSD in America, and I think there'll be a large demand for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. And so, as you know, I delayed the start of our discussion because I had to write some fundraising letters today. So I'm spending so much of my time asking people for money. And actually part of it I like. The part I like is when they say yes. But it's a lot of work, and so MAPS has an unusual opportunity in that most nonprofits that provide services, like let's say, let's feed the homeless, or let's, shelter the homeless, or let's, pay for medical care for people that can't afford it, or stuff like this. You're providing services and you got to keep replenishing the resources from new donations. But MAPS is actually a rare nonprofit that's talking about having a product at the end, a drug that's approved by the FDA that can be sold. And so I thought, okay, now we have an opportunity to create a sustainable nonprofit to be able to support further research by income that we might make from actually selling MDMA by prescription. And so we started thinking about how do we do that? and the first realization was that if we're going to do that, the sale of it can't stay inside MAPS. It's a taxable situation.
Got it.
But then we thought, and many people have sort of talked about concerns about legalizing marijuana. And one of the concerns has been that people don't trust American capitalism to handle things that have abuse potential. So, for example, we see that the alcohol and tobacco industry have a lot of their profits come from the heavy users of alcohol and the people that are addicted to tobacco.
Right.
And they do all sorts of stuff to, market to those people or market to young people to get the next generation of people starting to use these drugs. So there's a lot of concern about the for-profit model for selling drugs. And what's happened fairly recently is that there's been an improvement, you could say, in American capitalism. And the improvement has been the creation of what's called the Benefit Corporation, the Public Benefit Corporation. So for a normal for-profit company, the board of directors, the management, have an obligation to maximize profits. And, when you hear about hostile takeovers and, investors suing the management, it's because they say, you're not making enough money. We have ways that, if you do this, you do that, you can make more money. And we've seen this recently in the pharmaceutical industry, where there was this young guy that, bought an existing drug and raised the price from, 7,500%, so that because he could just make more money at it. So the for-profit motivation, you're not really able to say that you want to take social benefit into consideration. And so the benefit corporation has been created where you aren't maximizing profits, you're maximizing social benefits. And we felt, the MAPS board of directors felt, that approach was the best one for marketing MDMA as a medicine. If we were to say, okay, we're going to just maximizing profits, then, we're going to be responsible for training therapists. And only therapists and psychiatrists and doctors that are trained can prescribe MDMA. And if we were just out for making money, we would have lower standards than if we were out for maximizing social benefits. So we've created a benefit corporation that's legal in California and Delaware. There's several thousand of these benefit corporations. Dr. Bronner's is a benefit corporation. And David Bronner's on our board of directors. Ben & Jerry's, people know about that, was a benefit corporation. There's more and more of these benefit corporations. And so what MAPS has done is created a benefit corporation that's 100% owned by the nonprofit. So there's no investors. We're not taking in investors. There's no private enrichment. And so the corporate structure that we have is that people make tax-deductible donations to MAPS for our research. MAPS then invests in this benefit corporation, and the benefit corporation is actually the one that conducts our research. And if the research works out, they'll license from MAPS the rights to sell MDMA by prescription. And then whatever money the benefit corporation makes, they pay taxes on it, and the rest of it can go for the mission of MAPS. And the mission of the benefit corporation is virtually identical to the mission of MAPS, except for the fact that a part of their mission is to sell MDMA by prescription. So that's the basic idea, is that what we're trying to do is develop a model, not just for new ways to incorporate non-ordinary states of consciousness into psychotherapy and psychiatry, but a new model for businesses for selling drugs. And I would suggest that we would be a lot better off if the alcohol industry, the tobacco industry, and a lot of the marijuana industry were benefit corporations rather than traditional profit maximizing corporations.
Right. This structure keeps it clean, and when you're working in an industry where you're providing these services to help people with things serious, family systems, PTSD, where people are having traumatic issues, and then the company on top is a board of directors and investors. It's subject to a lot of abuse. It sounds like this structure could alleviate a lot of the foul play that could come up in the years to come with this.
I think so. Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense. And the reason that we've incorporated it in Delaware rather than in California, the reason is that in California they require a third-party standard to evaluate whether you're meeting public benefits. But there is no third-party standard developed for selling drugs. It's like, are you using, fair? Are you fair to your employees? Fair to the environment? What kind of, recycled toilet paper do you use? Not to trivialize it, but just, a lot of things that relate to businesses, but they don't relate to the way in which we share our protocols, as I described with Tilray. We put our data in the public domain. We end up trying to facilitate competition to us. If there will be competition, we want other people to do MDMA research. So in Delaware, they don't require third-party validation of your public benefit mission, but you have to articulate it. So we've been working with ethicists at the University of Pennsylvania and are developing our own standards of how we propose that we should be evaluated to, are we really meeting public benefit? And so it's pretty exciting to try to create this. And hopefully, once we've developed this set of standards, maybe there's a company called the B Corp, and they're the ones that have developed some of these public standards for traditional corporations. Maybe they'll adopt this for pharmaceutical companies, and then we'll see others voluntarily, going in this direction. But right now, we're the only, pharmaceutical company that we're aware of that's even talking about this kind of corporate structure.
Yeah. Well, bravo. I really, it's impressive. And that's why I wanted to make sure we included it in this talk, because I think it's history in the making. This is really cool. And I think I'm happy to be a part of it and watch it unfold moving forward. I have another question. I don't know if you still have a little time, but with this third round coming, how many patients would that be in the third round with the MDMA for PTSD?
Well, we are anticipating right now 400, and you need to do 2 large-scale phase 3 studies, multi-site studies. We're planning to have 2 of them. Each would have 200. One would be primarily in the United States, and the other would be maybe half or so in Europe, because what we want to do is have MDMA approved by the FDA and by the European Medicines Agency as well. So that's why we're developing sites in Germany and England, so that we'll have some research being done in EU countries. And the way in which you size the phase 3 studies is based on whole statistical calculations. And so we can't say yet what it's going to be, but the key factors are one measure that's called effect size. And so what effect size does is, most people are familiar with something that's what the term statistical significance means. So if something is, according to statistics, if it's 1 in 20 or less likely that it would be by chance, then it's called statistically significant. Now, if you've got 20 studies and they're all statistically significant, chances are one of them is going to be by chance. But that's what it means, statistical significance. And then you got multiple studies to show that. But you can have large numbers of subjects in a study and get statistical significance even if the difference between your 2 groups is very minor. So you can have statistical significance with clinically not having it matter much at all. So effect size is a statistical measure that looks at whether you've got a big effect or not. And it takes the effect that you have, the therapeutic, whatever your outcomes are, and it divides it by the variability across the number of subjects that you have. So the stronger of an effect you have and the less variability, meaning the more consistent the effect is, the fewer people you need in phase 3 to statistically see that something's really going on. And we have medium to large effect size in our studies, which is great. And so we'll know once we complete all of our phase 2 studies, and then we negotiate with FDA and present our statistical analysis and our proposal for phase 3. But right now we're assuming 400 subjects. And there's so much going on with clinical research that we're basically budgeting $50,000 per subject.
Wow.
Which means that we're talking roughly 20 million or more.
And the therapists administering it, that's a lot of therapists, right? And that they're spread all out throughout the world, right? So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
And CIIS, are you working with CIIS
yes.
for that? Yeah.
Yeah. So what we actually have is for our model, which we've talked about briefly before, which is more or less this 3.5 months with 3 8-hour MDMA sessions. It's roughly 40 hours of therapy. But it's not 40 hours of therapy with one therapist. It's 40 hours with a male-female co-therapist team. So it's roughly 80 therapist hours for each person. And that's where really a lot of the expense comes in. It's much more labor intensive. And then there's all sorts of the research context and all the way you gather the data, monitor the data, and all the other expenses involved in doing the studies, the way you screen people and the long-term follow-ups, the way you evaluate them. But our sense of it is that there's going to be a large amount of therapy time. And so then the key question is, what is the range of outcomes you get from different therapists? Because some therapists are probably likely to be better than other therapists, or some therapists are better with certain kinds of patients and other therapists are better with certain other kinds of patients. So a big part of what we're doing is figuring out how to train therapists. And so for anybody that wants to know what we do in terms of the therapy, you go to the MAPS website, you go to the research section, go to the MDMA page, and we have what's called the treatment manual. And that's something that describes the therapeutic approach, which is non-directive, meaning that the person is their own, the unconscious is the guide rather than the therapist. And the people have to do their own healing. We just support them in that process. And so right now, actually, Dr. Michael Mithofer and Annie, his wife, their male-female co-therapist team, they're running a therapist training program that started October 4th, goes to October 11th, and it involves people from multiple countries around the world right now. They're down in Charleston, they're from Canada, they're from England, they're throughout the U.S., and we have a 7-day program. Most of it is involving watching videotapes of therapy sessions and going over our treatment manual and then saying, here's how you respond in this situation. Here's opportunities to respond in that way. And it's quite exciting. I mean, I'm really kind of jealous, actually, that while I'm sitting here trying to raise money and talking to you about public education, there's a bunch of people that are watching these videotapes and actually trying to refine their skills as therapists. Because my ultimate goal personally is to become, a legal psychedelic psychotherapist. And that's what I really want to do. And so one big part about MAPS is going to be training therapists. And CIIS, which is the California Institute for Integral Studies based in San Francisco, they're starting a program. It's not a degree program, but it's called a certificate program. And I think it's involving several hundreds of hours. And they're wanting to start training people who want careers in psychedelic psychotherapy. And I think one of the things that's so exciting, particularly for young people right now, is that they're the first generation in 50 years that if you wanted to have a career in psychedelic psychotherapy, it's not a nutty, crazy thing.
Right.
And in fact, it's very possible that you can do that. It looks very much that you can do that. And so how we train therapists is going to be a key part, and it's going to be a big part of what MAPS does. And so, through CIIS, that's going to have the certificate program, and then I think with other academic institutions as well, eventually they're going to start training, because there are so many people that want to do this, because people have been using these drugs for thousands of years, and they touch on spirituality, on healing. It's just tremendously exciting. And so I think we've got a lot ahead of us. And how the outcomes are going to be in phase 3 is going to depend on how well we train these therapists. But I should say something else, which is that in our first study, even though we talk about this as MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, and the psychotherapy is the key point, when we looked at the results from our first study, mostly women survivors of childhood sexual abuse who had PTSD an average of over 19 years, the group that got the psychotherapy with placebo MDMA, they did pretty well, but the group that got the psychotherapy with the actual MDMA did a lot better. And so we're roughly guessing that 40% or so of the benefit comes from the psychotherapy, but 60% of the benefit comes from the MDMA. So despite the fact that Michael and Annie Mithofer are fantastic therapists, when they try to work with people with PTSD, they can help people, but when they add the MDMA, they get a lot more better. So we believe that the MDMA actually contributes more than the therapy to the ultimate outcome, which in a way is a relief in the sense, because there's going to be such a wide variety of capabilities and therapeutic skills in therapists. The question is, okay, so you've proved it in therapy, but now let's roll it out to thousands of therapists. Are the results going to be anywhere the same as what you got in research settings with these carefully trained people and everybody's observed? And so that's where, in a way, it's kind of reassuring that there is something.
It's a little forgiving because of the potency of the medicine is really, I think, what it comes down to is that how it really works.
Exactly.
And it gives the therapists a little bit of room, although, somebody well trained or having, decades of experience may be better because of these the medicine itself. It's pretty forgiving, and when you have a good protocol in place that allows, like you said, that the patient is the one who is healing themselves, and so when you have that protocol, I think it helps keep the integrity of the program, so that there's, like you said, people don't actually have to be the all-star number one therapist to actually still get the results.
Well, yes, that's very true. And not only that, but, we've been contacted by a lot of people who say, look, I went to a rave, I took MDMA, and I worked on some of my issues, and now I feel better. I mean, of all the psychedelics, MDMA is the most inherently therapeutic. But it's still enhanced by the psychotherapy, and the more troubled somebody is, the more they need the support. We've had actually people that have gone to raves and said, I took MDMA, I remembered prior sexual abuse, I was with a bunch of people who were trying to have fun, and I got the feeling that if I were to talk to them about what was going on, that it would bring them down, and so I just tried to stuff my feelings, and I ended up feeling a whole lot worse rather than better.
Right. This kind of brings us to the talk, brings us right into Zendo, right?
Yeah. I'm glad, Joseph, thank you. That's very good. So maybe that's a good thing to end on, which is just to say that, one of the things, we talked a lot about the backlash against psychedelics. And, I talked a little bit about how the work with marijuana I'm doing is trying to unblock political suppression of research and in a way to protect the psychedelics. But another thing to protect the psychedelics is to look at what is the cause of potential backlash. And in the 60s, the backlash really was political. That's where we got Nixon involved, and Timothy Leary, the most dangerous man in America. And it was people identifying as counterculture and challenging the status quo, challenging the Vietnam War, starting the environmental movement, all sorts of things. But I think that's faded over the last 50 years. And now the main thing driving the drug war is parents worrying about their kids. And kids go to all these festivals, electronic dance music festivals are growing incredibly. And some people take MDMA, or what they hope is MDMA, but often isn't. And they have difficult experiences. I mean, people even are dying sometimes from overheating or from drinking too much water, hyponatremia. And so what we've decided to do is to try to create a model and a way to build the case for a post-prohibition world. And so what MAPS has done is started a project which we now call the Zendo Project, which is to provide support for people that take psychedelics at these events, dance concerts, festivals, and end up, getting into difficult circumstances. And, the other point there is that even if you're, very experienced, difficult experiences are inevitable. And not only are they inevitable, but they're not to be run away from. They're some of the most productive learning experiences that you could have. So we've started this. We did it at Burning Man. We've done it at Africa Burn, at Envision in Costa Rica, at Boom Festival in Portugal, and we bring trained therapists, psychiatrists, medical professionals, and others who are informally trained. And it's mostly volunteers. And at Burning Man, most recently, we had about 180 people go through the training program. We had 2 sites for the first time ever. And we just try to support people through their difficult experiences. And we find that when you do that, instead of getting arrested or getting taken to the medical staff and getting tranquilized and taken to a hospital, if you just have compassionate care of people that are willing to sit with people, sometimes for 8 hours, sometimes longer than 8 hours, and we have shifts, we 24 hours, 24/7, that people can grow from these experiences and have something that they end up looking back on appreciatively, and then they can often go back to the party too. So that's part of this effort to build a post-prohibition world, and also part of training therapists, because it's a great opportunity for people that want to learn to be therapists to go through our training for the Zendo Project, and also to sit with people who didn't intend to be working on difficult issues, but have just ended up doing that.
Thank you. Yes. Well, as you know, I was there at the Zendo, and my wife and I, we did the training, and we did a shift, and we were able to work with a few people, and I really feel like it was exactly what they needed, and just to have a safe place to go and be a part of that, and also to be from our side of it, as people sitting, as volunteers. It was really beautiful to be in a group with the volunteers of all these people coming together and in a mature way to hold space and support. At Burning Man, it's all about giving and contribution. So for us, it was our 3rd time there, and it was an opportunity for us to give back to the playa and to the community there. But it was also, I also found it to be deeply fulfilling to be around other people who some very well-established therapists and just people in the helping industry who come together. And that part of it was just so beautiful for us, that we were able to connect with other people kind of doing this similar work out there right now. So there's so many elements to that is healing, I think, for the community at large. So. Yeah, thank you for that. So I think we're just about finished up here, huh? It's been a great call. And I guess for anybody listening who this is, new for, or they're excited about this, or they want to help, how do people help you? How do they get involved? What are some simple ways for people to get involved and help out and support this?
Well, obviously, because we're a nonprofit, we only operate on donations. So people could make a tax-deductible donation, and now that it's the end of the year, that's something that, or not quite, but getting near the end of the year when people start thinking about making tax-deductible donations, so they can go to the MAPS website and donate online, or just send a check. I think one of the other parts, and because we've talked earlier about the importance of public education, one way that people can help is to learn as much as they can. A lot of people have been exposed to a lot of misinformation about drugs, and just speak to your parents, speak to your children, speak to your friends, and try to see what people think and try to clear up any misconceptions. And then also people like you and your wife could donate their time by volunteering for the Zendo Project. People can also start getting politically involved. We're going to try to end the government monopoly on the provision of marijuana for research, and we're getting ready to submit a new application to DEA for that. So once that starts, people could look at the website, and there'll be information about calling their members of Congress. Also, the harm reduction work, the Zendo Project that we do, is inhibited to a great extent by measures that passed Congress in 2003 called the RAVE Act, which was meant to be reducing America's vulnerability to ecstasy, which is, ridiculous. We're vulnerable to ecstasy. But that criminalized harm reduction, and that has had a chilling effect on the willingness of festival organizers, concert promoters, things like that, to provide psychedelic harm reduction, because that means that they know that psychedelics are being used. And that's what can be held against them, and they can have their assets taken, and they can be put in jail. So we're going to be working on a project called Amend the Rave Act. People go to amendtheraveact.org right now. There's a website. We don't have a congressional sponsor yet for it, but people can be educating themselves about that. And then I think people can also, if they happen to have questions, they can write Ask MAPS at MAPS.org. And we have somebody that monitors that, and we'll be able to respond to those questions. And just, there's a wealth of information on the MAPS website. And I think wherever you are, just sort of, and here's another big thing, and maybe this is a good thing to end on, which is look at what's happened with gay marriage and gay rights. But it's happened because people coming out. And people saying, you didn't think you knew anybody that's gay, but I'm gay, and you think highly of me, or I've done this good thing or that good thing. So I think what we need is a coming out process of people that have done psychedelics.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah, I think that's something that's really important, and people can contribute in that way by taking courage and coming out of the psychedelic closet.
I tell you, man, you are a part of my coming out of the psychedelic closet. So thank you so much. And psychedelictimes.com, and just the fact that we put the word psychedelic in there is, I give you credit for that, because it was really a part of me putting the flag, in the sand, drawing a line and saying, yeah, that's what this is about. It's not about alternative healing or, holistic. No, because we threw around all these different names. We said, no, this is psychedelic. And so thank you for that, and for making it okay to come out of the closet and not be, like you said, professionals. We're living normal lives. We have children, and we want the best, and we're not establishment or government, and that, these things can all work together. So I think I like that. That's a great note to end on. Come out of the psychedelic closet.
Great. Terrific. It's a pleasure talking to you today.
You too. Thank you so much, Rick.
Okay. Good luck with your podcast. This is wonderful.
Once again, thank you so much for tuning into our first ever podcast. I really appreciate you listening, and you made it all the way to the end. So if you're at all inspired by what Rick has shared, check out maps.org for information on how to donate and volunteer. But most importantly, if you've had psychedelic experiences that have impacted your life in a positive way, share that with your family and friends and loved ones. The time is now, people. Psychedelic times. And if you're interested in psychedelic therapy for addiction or PTSD or spiritual growth and development, please go to psychedelictimes.com and give us a shout.